As designers, it comes naturally to always be on the lookout for techniques, tools, and shortcuts that might aid our design process. It's likely you've come around a similar looking chart at least once in your career. The main idea behind these images is to highlight all the associations a single color might have with our feelings and emotions. They're clear, handy, and, in my opinion, completely useless. Here's why. Let's start from the basics. Color is comprised of three different components: hue, brightness, and saturation. The first indicates its tint, which depends on the wavelength of the light a given object won't absorb. Brightness indicates how light or dark the color appears, and it depends on the amount of light that gets reflected back to our eyes. Saturation indicates the intensity of a color. It is what differentiates a pale color from a pastel one. In our day-to-day lives, when we talk about color, most of the times we actually mean hue, what distinguishes red from green or blue from yellow. This is not to say that we're incapable of differentiating between this steel blue and this electric blue, just that people instinctively tend to place more inherent value in this property. This is probably why it's so easy to overlook the importance of a color's brightness and saturation when talking about its properties, and especially its impact on our emotions. These colors have the same hue, but one of them is slightly brighter and saturated. So what's the deal? Why is this so important? Well, even in color psychology, there seems to be a significant bias towards a color's hue compared to all of its other properties. Studies rarely focus on shades as something made of different components. We could all agree that looking at this red is much less pleasant than looking at this red, yet their hues are exactly the same. The first problem with this chart is that it treats hue as the star property of a color, when in fact its saturation and brightness are arguably as impactful. A recent study on the effects of color on our emotions found that a color's brightness and saturation are as important as its hue when it comes to defining its impacts on our feelings. Subjects were shown a set of colors and had to rate their current emotional state on a scale of arousal and valence, or pleasantness for us creative folks. Results show how reported arousal increases when the color's hue goes from blue to red, yet the color's effects were less dependent on its hue than they were on its saturation, which seems to be even more impactful. In fact, when subjects were only shown desaturated colors, hue had barely any significance on their reported arousal. These two colors would technically fall under the same category in one of the many color psychology charts we previously looked at, and yet their level of saturation makes one of them at least twice as arousing. Some might argue arousal isn't that significant when talking about color psychology, so let's see what happens with the valence scale. When it comes to how pleasant a color feels, its saturation seems to play a key role. The typical color preference pattern, blue, green, and red, seems to be valid only for highly saturated colors. Looking at this graph, you can also tell why I chose a really intense bright red to represent the unpleasant shade previously in the video. Here are the scores of the same colors but with medium and low saturation. This gap between the two levels of saturation suggests there's a strong link between a color's intensity and how pleasant it may feel. The main problem with these charts is that they don't differentiate between this green and this green. They focus on a single property and remain blind to the many other variables that can be ignored when you're designing. And that's not all. These charts don't seem to take into account a color's context and what culture it's set in. Context can be key to some designs and can completely alter the intended message of a specific color. We can clearly see this in fields where color has a certain weight and implied meaning. Take politics as an example. The color red has long been associated with communism in virtually all of its forms. In parts of the EU and most of the Eastern world, the Communist Party and all of its imagery and propaganda built lasting connection with this color that still lingers to this day. This might and actually should affect the color choices we make today when designing for politics. Red may very well be intended to convey the idea of strength and resolution, but in EU's politics it will always call back to its history before any abstract qualities. This problem gets even more drastic when we consider the food industry and its packaging. Color choices are almost forced in most cases. In the food industry, color is strongly linked to the flavor and the origin of the product. 90% of the times, red will stand for strawberry, yellow for banana, and orange, well, for orange. Culture can be even more crucial. In the US, blue is widely considered to be the ultimate corporate color. It's most people's favorite color in the West and is a pretty safe choice when it comes to brand identity. Yet, this isn't the case for many countries and cultures. Blue is perceived as cold and evil in East Asia. It stands for warmth in Holland, coldness in Sweden, death in Iran, and purity in India. This gets to the heart of many of the problems with color psychology. It's a system based on feelings and ideas of a narrow slice of the Western world, which, admittedly, is where most of our work is developed. Trying to find reliable associations between color and abstract ideas is not an empty goal per se, but it can hardly go further than broad and vague statements that hold true when a few crucial variables can be controlled. This is where color psychology loses most of its appeal, in my opinion. It paints with such a broad brush that no meaningful insight ever comes from it. Even a quick research in the field a particular design is meant for will probably end up yielding more useful results. When making tools to aid our design process, we tend to forget we never work in a vacuum. When designing for a specific field, everyday tools can allow us to read up on its history and culture, benchmark our competitors to evaluate their choices, spot general trends, and recognize opportunities. These are all variables that should inform a design process more than a superficial chart ever should. A few days ago, Ben Crick, creative director at Collins New York, was interviewed for Meet the Creatives on Instagram Live. During the Q&A, he briefly talked about the color choices behind Mailchimp's rebrand. Its main color, Cavendish yellow, was chosen by his team for two reasons: its obvious association with monkeys, Mailchimp's mascot, and its uniqueness in the market of their client. In other words, none of their competitors was using yellow as their hero color. That was an opportunity to stand out.
Literally, the Mailchimp color, and I didn't select the color, but the Mailchimp color was selected in part because of it's a company called Mailchimp, and yellow is the color of bananas, and that's hilarious and makes sense with their just company ethos, which is totally off the wall.
Right.
But it also happens to be a totally differentiating color. No other company in their category, and not many companies at all at their scale use yellow as a brand color. So it differentiates, which is a great business goal.
Rarely do we realize how narrow a range of color choices can be when working in the real world. Every brand has a history, a soul, a market, and a culture behind it. We might want to take some time and look deeper into some of its roots and abstractions, but we also have to remind ourselves that a lot of the times, yellow might simply mean banana. Well, that's a pretty weird ending. Thanks for watching.